My name is Father Joseph Gill, a priest of the Diocese of Bridgeport, and thank you so much for joining us on Catholic Truth as we dive deeper into the Word of God and into the way in which God's truth is spoken through the Catholic Church. So when I was growing up, my sister was a big animal aficionado, and she had this book, and the title of the book was Animals Are Almost Human. And it was kind of a nice book. It talked about some of the ways in which animals and human beings have some similarities, like animals like to play and how they get their food. But I kind of wanted to burn that book, because just by the title, to me, it was like, wait a second. Animals are not almost human. There's a giant gap between human beings and animals. We have such a greater dignity as human beings than animals do. So what is it that makes human beings different than animals? Because we're not just evolved apes. We're something so much more than that. Well, let's dive deeper into Genesis to see exactly where we came from. In the beginning, Genesis chapter 1, verse 26, we hear about how we are created in a unique way. It says here, "Then God said, 'Let us make man in our image, after our likeness.'" All right, so let us make man in our image and after our likeness. Well, first of all, image and likeness, that sounds like the exact same thing, right? Why does God need to say it twice? Well, because image and likeness are actually not the same thing. Those are two different ideas. So to be in the image of God means that we have the capacities of what God can do. We have the powers of God. In other words, we have a soul, and that soul has an intellect, which allows us to know things deeply. We can know the essences of things, and we have free will, which allows us to choose to love. These are the things that set us apart from all the other animals. We are in the image of God. Likeness of God is something somewhat different, because the likeness means that we act like God. It means that we use that intellect and that free will in a way that God would use it, to love profoundly, to know deeply the truth. It's kind of like this. Imagine if you took two pennies. One penny was a bright, shiny new penny, and the other one had been in circulation for a number of years, and it was all dark and kind of smudged. Well, both of those pennies have the exact same image, right? Yeah, it's the image of Abraham Lincoln. But one of those pennies shows that image a lot clearer. It has more of a likeness to Abraham Lincoln. And of course, it's that shiny penny versus the one that's all dinged up and it's hard to see. So in the same way, every human being who exists is in the image of God. We have that dignity of having a soul, of having an intellect, and having a free will. But some people have chosen to use their intellect and their free will in a way that glorifies God, in a way that loves like God loves and knows like God knows. So, for example, the saints are a lot more in the likeness of God than sinners. Saints are probably a lot holier than, me and you. So I think of like Mother Teresa. She really radiated God. And people said that when they saw her face, just the joy on her smile, the light in her eyes, she really radiated the likeness of God. So image and likeness are not exactly the same thing. But now, wait a second. You may say, well, how can we prove that we have a soul? Because it's true. We can't see it. We can't touch it. It's not something that's scientifically verifiable. In fact, I think it was in the 1800s that there was a czar from Russia who wanted to disprove Christianity. And so he actually locked a man in a wooden barrel until he died. And then he had all of his scientists standing around the wooden barrel, and he ripped off the top. And when he saw that no soul came out, he said, "Look, clearly, it's just another one of the animals. This idea of a soul is preposterous." Well, of course, it's not scientifically verifiable, because the soul is immaterial. Immaterial doesn't mean fake, but it does mean that it doesn't have something that can be measured by science. But I'm going to give you 3 arguments for the existence of the soul. First of all, the argument from beauty. I love to go hiking. It's one of my favorite things to do. And a lot of times I'll go up to this beautiful precipice where I can just see everywhere. And you get up there and you come through the trees, and all of a sudden your vista just opens wide and you say, "Wow, this is so beautiful. I want to take a picture. I want to write a poem. I want to write a song. I just want to stand here and observe this incredible beauty. I'm speechless. I'm overwhelmed with awe." And then I'll see somebody come up there and they'll be walking their dog. And the other person will be like, "Wow, this is incredible. I'm amazed." And what will the dog be doing? Scratch, 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 sniffing around for food. Animals have no ability to appreciate beauty. Have you ever heard a dog say to himself, I think I need to redecorate my doghouse, maybe repaint, maybe move the furniture. Of course not, right? Animals don't care about beautiful things. They never do something solely for the purpose of beauty. Even things that animals do that are beautiful. For example, a peacock with his plumage. Well, that's simply a mating ritual. It's a way in which he shows off that that's a man that other female peacocks can be attracted to. But by contrast, human beings do a lot of things for no other reason other than beauty. Sometimes I'll go home and I'll just play guitar, and no one else is listening. It's just me and my guitar. Why do I do it? Because it's beautiful, and it's worth doing simply because of beauty. So I think one way in which we know we have a soul is that human beings act for the sake of beauty, which animals don't. A second reason we know we have a human soul is that human beings, always, every culture, has had some type of religion. Whether it was Aborigines in Australia, whether it was Amazon tribes people, whether it was Muslims or Jews or Hindus or Buddhists, every culture has had some way, some form of reaching out to the divine. It's something innate and deep within us that we just hunger for a relationship with the transcendent God. And every culture throughout human history has always had some sort of religion. But you never see animals doing that, right? You don't see dogs bowing down to prayer. You don't see elephants worshiping some deity or making some sort of sacrifice to some god. Only human beings do that. And I think that's another way in which we can have evidence that we have a soul, because we're trying to reach out for the transcendent God. Finally, a third argument I think that's powerful for the existence of the soul is that human beings can act for an unseen future reward. When I'm teaching high schoolers, I'll ask them, so, why are you in school? And a lot of times they'll sarcastically say, well, because my mom made me, or because I'd get arrested if I didn't go. Okay, but what's your goal? Well, I want to graduate. Great. Well, then what? I want to go to college. Well, why? So I can get a good job. Well, why? So I can make a lot of money and have a nice house and a wife and kids and a dog named Rex and everything that I ever wanted in the American dream. I say, that's awesome. That's great. So you're doing something right now in this year that's not going to impact you for 10 or more years. Interesting. We can act for an unseen future reward. In fact, any Christian is living their life for heaven. That's an unseen future reward. I've never seen heaven. I've never been there. I don't know anyone that has been there. And yet I'm acting right now for something that I can't see in the future. We do that all the time. When we go on a diet, we say, in a month I want to lose 10 pounds, so I'm going to give up this chocolate now so I can get this reward in the future. Animals can't act that way. They act solely on instinct. And if you presented a dog with a bowl of food, he's going to eat it if he's hungry. He's not going to think, trying to lose 10 pounds, I'm going to give it up right now. I've seen a lot of fat dogs in my life, and it's up to us, the animal owners, to say, all right, I'm putting the dog on a diet. You can't have this food, because animals can't act for a future reward. So I think these are three ways in which we can have evidence that we have a soul. But now, wait a second. What's interesting about this passage from Genesis, let's go down a little deeper. It says, verse 27, so God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female, he created them. Male and female, he created them. So is the differences between male and female only on the level of the body, or the body and the soul? The answer is, it's on the body and the soul. As John Paul II wrote in his Theology of the Body, he said, the body reveals the soul. So that fundamental difference between men and women is not just physical, it's also spiritual. And men and women then mirror God. They're in the image of God in different ways. Men are in the image of God's strength, his ability to come through, his power. We see that reflected in the physical strongness of men. Women are in the image and likeness of God's love, God's tenderness, God's beauty. We see that in the physical beauty of women. Think about it just from your own experience. Imagine for a moment that you're a little kid. You scrape your knee. Who are you going to run to? I'm going to run to my mom, not my dad, because my dad would take one look at that and be like, ha, cool scar, son. My mom, though, is going to make it all better because she's the image and likeness of God's love and tenderness. But if there's a burglar in my house and I'm a little kid, who am I going to run to? I'm going to run to my dad, because my dad's going to get out the shotgun and my mom's going to be hiding under the bed with me, right? So we see that men and women are in the image and likeness of God in different ways. And that's a beautiful thing. We call that complementarity, how men and women work together to form kind of the complete image and likeness of God. So unfortunately, though, this is what God's plan was for our souls and our bodies, that we were supposed to reflect, that our bodies are supposed to reflect the soul, and that men and women's souls are supposed to be complementary, and that we're supposed to have this intellect so we can know truth and this free will to love. But original sin entered the picture. And we're all familiar with original sin, how our first parents disobeyed God in consuming this fruit in the garden, listened to lies, and therefore the entire makeup of the human person was corrupted. And that's why we don't see people living totally in the likeness of God. So just like we have 4 parts to the human person, then we've got body and soul, and the soul has 2 parts of intellect and free will. So all of those parts got corrupted because of original sin. What's the corruption on the body? Suffering and death. That was not part of God's original plan. His plan was for our bodies to rejoice always in the fullness of health and the fullness of life. But because of original sin, suffering and death entered the world. The suffering that happened to our soul then is separation from God. No longer do we automatically have God's grace within us. That means when we're born with original sin, which means that we need baptism in order to be refilled with God's divine life. But what happened to the intellect and the free will is also fascinating as well. Before the fall, Adam and Eve, our first parents, had the ability to know things intuitively. In other words, it was really easy to learn. They'd be able to look at something and know its molecular composition. They'd be able to know what is truth and what is error. They'd never have to sit there and think like, is that true? Is that false? I don't know. They would have this great ability to perceive truth and falsehood. So we said, what we call it is that after the fall, the intellect is darkened. It becomes difficult to learn things. But what happened with the free will is the one thing that I think I struggle with on a daily basis. We call it concupiscence. It's kind of like this. Have you ever been to an all-you-can-eat buffet? I love all-you-can-eat buffets. In fact, where I'm from in Maryland, there's an all-you-can-eat buffet called Golden Corral, which is such a fitting name because it really is just a feeding trough for humans. I love it. And you go there, and you get this mountain of food on your plate. And then you go up a second time, you get a new plate, another mountain of food, new plate, another mountain of food, until you got like 7 plates stacked up there. And you're like, oh my gosh, that was amazing. My belt buckle is popping out because you're so full, you're stuffed. But then you look up and you see the pie table. And you realize, I haven't been to the pie table. I have to go to the pie table. And you know that if you go to the pie table, it's going to hurt. You know that it's going to physically be painful for you to eat that pie. Your guts might spill out all over the pavement. But what do? You do it anyway. You get up and you go to the pie table. What concupiscence means is that now we desire things that are harmful to us. Our desires are disordered. So now instead of desiring that which is truly good, we now desire things that are bad for us. That's why people are tempted into drugs or alcoholism, because it seems so good. Even though if you sat there and thought about it, should I get drunk? No, I probably shouldn't. But we still do it anyway because we have these disordered desires. You see, before the fall, broccoli would have been more delicious than chocolate. Imagine that, right? Because we would have desired that which is truly fulfilling. So now we constantly have to be fighting against that concupiscence, that weakness of our will. But God's grace is stronger. And so, when we turn it over to God and say, God, I have this huge concupiscence. My desires are so disordered, He can come and bring order then back into our desires. That's what the grace of God can do. And so, my friends, we as human beings, even despite the fallen nature that we find ourselves, are still creatures of great dignity. In a very real way, we kind of are the bridge between heaven and earth. We were meant to have dominion over creation, which means that we're supposed to rule creation in God's name. Listen to what God says here in chapter 1, verse 28 of Genesis. And God blessed Adam and Eve, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. Have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the air and over every living thing that moves upon the earth. So man's role really is to rule creation, not as a tyrant, but as a steward, as someone who says, you know what, I'm just simply here in God's name to take care of this garden that God has created for us. You know, it's interesting to notice that there's actually two creation stories in Genesis. There's one in Genesis 1 and one in Genesis 2. And in Genesis 1, we're made immediately in the image and likeness of God. And in Genesis 2, we're made from the dust of the earth. And it shows how human beings kind of span both sides, that we're both from God, but we're also from the earth, which means that we're going to die. We're going to return to the dust from which we came. Yet nevertheless, this is what separates human beings from animals, that we have a soul, we have the ability to know and to love God, and that we have the ability to be like him in his likeness. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Father Joseph Gill. Check out my book that just came out, The Shores of Heaven, on Amazon.com, and also some of my music on iTunes and Spotify. God bless.